On a night when famine gripped the land and sickness crawled through the homes of the poor, the child came into the world. The midwife had already buried 3 infants that week, their bodies shrunken and gray before they had ever learned to cry. And so when Elias slipped from the womb, the silence in the room felt heavier than death itself. His mother, pale and trembling, clutched him to her chest, waiting for the thin gasp, the weak wail, the sound that would prove he belonged among the living. But what filled the air was not the fragile cry of a newborn. It was nothing. No sound at all. His small chest rose and fell once, shallow and measured, as if his body already knew the work of life and had no need to announce it. The midwife, unsettled, slapped him gently, then harder, desperate for the wail that never came. His eyes opened instead, wide and steady, and in that unblinking gaze those around him felt something unnatural stir. The village had long known hunger, but on that particular winter night even the strongest men were hollow with want. Fever carried away mothers, leaving infants starved at their breasts. Fires burned low because there was little wood to spare, and the cries of the living mixed with the coughs of the dying. Yet Elias was born as if he had been waiting for such a time. His stillness seemed made for famine, his silence tailored for plague. His mother whispered with cracked lips that he had come too silent, too knowing, and in her words was not relief but dread, as if she felt she had delivered not hope but a burden. In those first hours the midwife noted how his limbs were too stiff, his head too steady, his gaze too sharp for a child who should have been blind to the world. She crossed herself and muttered that God had spared him for a reason, but even as she prayed, she avoided looking into his eyes. The neighbors who came to offer thin congratulations left quickly, muttering to one another that the child had not cried, not once. Some claimed that he had simply listened, as if marking each breath around him, as if already measuring the fragility of human life. His father, a man worn thin by fields of barren soil, poured himself ale until his tongue grew loose. He told anyone who would listen that the boy's silence was not a curse, but a gift, a strength that would carry him through famine when weaker children perished. But deep inside, even he avoided holding his son for too long. There was a heaviness in that small body, a weight not of flesh but of something unnamed. He left Elias mostly to his wife, who rocked him without song because every lullaby died in her throat when she saw how intently he stared back at her. Days turned into weeks, and still Elias did not cry. Not when hunger twisted his belly. Not when cold seeped into the one blanket that wrapped him. Not when his mother's cracked hands trembled to keep him warm. The village children shrieked in discomfort when hunger struck, their voices echoing like broken bells. But Elias remained silent. He seemed to conserve every sound, as if saving it for something larger, something the rest of them could not yet see. His silence began to spread unease like a sickness. Mothers clutched their children tighter when Elias was near, whispering warnings to stay away from the boy who did not cry, as if his quiet might reach out and claim them too. The priest baptized him, but his hands shook when water touched the boy's head. He said the words, but he stumbled on the final prayer, as though the ritual had lost its power in the presence of a child who never wailed. When the service ended, villagers claimed the holy water rippled on its own, tiny waves forming though no hand disturbed it. They left the church quickly that day, crossing themselves again and again as if to ward off something unholy that had already taken root. Elias's mother began to notice something else. When death visited the homes of neighbors, when fever took the old and hunger the young, she would find Elias awake in the night, eyes fixed on the window as though he had been waiting. Hours later, word would spread that another villager had died. The timing was always precise, as if the boy had felt it the moment it happened. His mother stopped speaking of it aloud, for even she feared what it might mean. But her body grew thinner from sleepless nights. Her mind eroded by the weight of raising a child who seemed to belong more to the grave than to the living. By the time Elias turned 1 year old, famine had taken more than half the village. The weak lay in shallow graves, while those who survived carried emptiness in their eyes. Yet Elias thrived. His body did not wither as the others did. His cheeks held color when others had gone gray. His silence was no longer just strange. It was wrong, a defiance of nature itself. For the villagers who had once pitied him, suspicion replaced sympathy. They began to whisper that perhaps his silence was not merely odd but protective, that maybe he was fed not only by his mother's milk but by something taken from those who perished. The fear that clung to him grew sharper, though he was still only a boy, still wordless, still watching. And so his first year in the world passed not as a blessing, but as a shadow. He was born when famine reigned, and yet famine never touched him. He was born in silence, and silence followed him like a mark. The villagers did not yet know the weight of what had been born among them, but they felt it like the stillness before a storm, like the unnatural calm before a scream. Elias had entered the world not as a child should, but as something else entirely. An intrusion, a warning, a life that had no right to begin. Under the weak light of dawn, Elias's eyes became the subject of whispers. They were too steady, too fixed, too unwilling to blink. Other children turned away when he stared, their play falling silent under the weight of his gaze. He was not yet a man, not even grown enough to run, but there was an ancient patience in the way he looked at others, as if time itself slowed for him. Mothers began to pull their children closer whenever he passed, muttering that his eyes watched too long. It was not only the children who feared him. The animals did too. Dogs that barked at strangers would whimper and crawl under tables when Elias entered the room. Horses rolled their eyes and stamped, their flesh twitching as though sensing a predator nearby. Chickens fell silent when he stood near their coops. Even the rats that infested the granaries seemed to scatter at the sound of his quiet footsteps. The villagers tried to explain it away, saying that the boy was simply odd, too serious for his age. But the silence of Elias's nature gnawed at them. When other children were beaten for mischief, they wailed and begged for mercy, but Elias endured punishment without a sound. His father once struck him with a leather strap for refusing to join the harvest chores, but the boy's face remained calm, unflinching, his eyes steady on his father's shaking hand. The silence unnerved the man so deeply that he never raised the strap again. It was as if Elias absorbed pain without protest, storing it somewhere unseen. The village said he felt nothing, but the truth was worse. He seemed to feel everything too much, too sharply. Yet he never revealed it. His body became a vessel for quiet storms that no one could name. At night, when fever swept through the village, Elias would sit at the foot of his bed, eyes open, watching shadows crawl across the walls. His mother would whisper prayers to keep him asleep, but he never closed his eyes until the sickness claimed another neighbor. Then, only then, did he rest. Some began to say he was not resting at all, but listening to death, waiting for it like one waits for a friend. His mother grew pale, her strength waning under the weight of raising a boy she feared to cradle. She knew he was no ordinary child. She had felt it the moment she looked into his silent eyes the night he was born. By the time Elias reached his 5th year, the famine had thinned, but the sickness remained. Other children tried to laugh and play in the dirt roads, but their games stuttered when Elias came near. He did not join them, yet he never left. He stood at the edges watching, as though memorizing each gesture, each sound of joy, each fragile breath. The children said his stare was too long, too hungry, as if he was imagining how they would look when they stopped moving. They began to fear that he was not simply watching them, but rehearsing something in his mind, something that had nothing to do with play. It was during one winter morning that a boy named Marcus, older and braver, tried to test Elias. He mocked him, shoved him, tried to force a cry from him. Elias only stared, his face empty. And then, in a voice quiet but certain, he said Marcus would choke on a bone before the next new moon. The villagers dismissed it as childish spite. But weeks later, Marcus died exactly that way, his throat blocked by a shard of chicken bone. His family swore that Elias had cursed him, that his unblinking eyes had marked him for death. The village, already uneasy, began to shun him openly. From then on, Elias's father drank heavily, drowning in guilt and unease, while his mother shrank into herself. The boy was left to wander the village lanes, silent and watchful. He seemed always to appear where death was soon to strike, a sick neighbor, a wounded animal, an elder who would not wake by morning. People claimed they saw him staring at windows where the dying lay, hours before the last breath was taken. He was not welcome, but he was always there, as if he and death shared a path invisible to others. The villagers, though hardened by hunger and loss, began to dread his presence more than famine itself. They whispered that he was not merely a child who survived sickness, but something that carried sickness with him, something that fed on it. His silence became heavier than words, his stare sharper than knives. By the end of that year, no one doubted it anymore. Elias was not like the other children. He was the watcher, the one who saw too much, too long, and too clearly. And while others prayed for life to return to normal, Elias seemed to be waiting for something else. The next death, the next silence, the next lesson in how fragile the human body could be. The first time Elias spoke of death, it was with a certainty that silenced every voice around him. He was no longer the odd boy who never cried, no longer just the child whose eyes lingered too long. He had grown into something the villagers feared to name. Winter had settled heavy upon the valley, and with it came sickness that clung to the lungs of the weak. Among those afflicted was Herr Reinhardt, an old neighbor whose body had grown thin from years of labor. The man coughed blood into cloths and prayed to live through the season. Yet before Reinhardt's family could summon a priest, Elias told his mother in a flat, almost bored tone that the man would drown in his own lungs before dawn on the 3rd night. His mother shushed him sharply, her hands trembling, but the words spread like fire through the village, carried on the breath of children who had overheard. When the night came, the house of Reinhardt filled with a choking stench. His body twisted in the bed, his lips darkening as fluid filled his chest. He drowned in silence, his hands clawing at the sheets, his eyes wide with terror until the final moment. By morning, the village knew that Elias's prediction had come true. It was not only the death that unsettled them, but the detail. The way Elias had described it beforehand, as though he had already witnessed the man's last breath. Fear settled deeper than grief. Neighbors whispered that a child should not know such things, should not speak of them with that chilling accuracy. Elias did not flinch when confronted about it. He did not gloat, nor did he explain. He simply watched as Reinhardt's body was carried to the churchyard. When others wept, he tilted his head, studying the stillness of the corpse with the same quiet focus he had shown since infancy. It was as though he was learning, as though every death was a lesson written only for him. What disturbed the villagers most was not the prophecy, but the composure. He was untouched by fear or sorrow, untouched by the mystery of death itself. For Elias, it seemed less a tragedy and more a familiar routine. The priests were summoned to investigate. They questioned him, hoping to uncover trickery, but Elias offered only silence. When pressed, he described Reinhardt's last hours again, down to the sound of the man's gasping chest, the rattling rhythm of his lungs filling with liquid. The priests left shaken, muttering that such detail could not come from a child. One priest claimed Elias's words carried no hesitation, no imagination. It was spoken like memory, as if the boy had been inside the dying man's body. Unable to accuse him directly, they buried the matter in prayer. Yet unease grew heavier with each passing day. Children began avoiding him entirely. Where once they only feared his stare, they now crossed the street when he approached, clutching each other's hands and whispering that he could see inside them. Some claimed he was counting their breaths, deciding who would be next. His silence in the fields, his watchfulness at church, his unblinking presence at funerals, it all deepened the suspicion that Elias was not merely strange but marked. Parents forbade their children from speaking his name at night, believing the sound alone might invite his attention. Elias, for his part, did not resist his isolation. He seemed to prefer it. He spent long hours in the churchyard, lingering among gravestones as though he understood their hidden language. Villagers who passed by swore they saw him running his small fingers along the carved names, pausing at fresh earth as if reading secrets no one else could see. He rarely spoke, but when he did, it was with unnerving precision. Once he told a woman that the candle she lit for her husband's grave would be snuffed by wind before she reached home. She returned moments later, trembling, the wick cold just as he had said. Each new confirmation fed the rumor that Elias was not merely a seer of death, but its companion. His mother wept in silence, carrying both guilt and terror. She wanted to believe her son was only misunderstood, a child too quiet, too thoughtful. But even she began to notice the patterns. She awoke one night to find him standing at the window, his eyes reflecting pale moonlight, whispering to himself. She pressed her ear to the door and realized he was repeating names. Names of villagers she feared might not live to see spring. By Mourning. One of those names had indeed joined the dead. She dared not tell anyone what she heard. The village itself shifted under the weight of Elias's presence. People prayed more often, lit candles longer, and crossed themselves twice when passing him in the road. Yet beneath the rituals was a growing acceptance that Elias did not merely predict death. He heralded it. The first death, Reinhardt's drowning lungs, had opened the gate. Now the boy stood on the threshold, silent and certain, watching, waiting for the next body to fall. The monastery school was meant to discipline boys, to shape them into obedient servants of God. For Elias, it became the first stage of something darker. The brothers welcomed him reluctantly, already aware of the whispers that followed him from his village. But rules demanded they take in the child of a poor family. He walked through the heavy wooden doors in silence, his gaze roaming the halls lined with crucifixes and candle smoke, as if measuring each space for some unseen purpose. Where other boys fidgeted and played, Elias stood still, observing. The priests hoped he would learn humility, prayer, and work. What they did not see was how the boy was already shaping lessons of his own. At first he began with insects. The monastery walls were damp, alive with crawling life. And Elias collected beetles, ants, and moths with a strange devotion. While other children swatted pests away, Elias brought them carefully to his desk. He arranged their bodies in lines, circles, and spirals, pressing them into wax or onto paper as if preserving them in symbols only he understood. He whispered numbers as he worked, counting not in playful rhythm but in precise, steady patterns, his lips shaping sequences beyond his years. At night, when the others lay restless in bed, Elias stayed awake, turning candlelight over the delicate husks of flies, watching shadows dance around their wings. The boys who shared his dormitory began to whisper that he was writing secret prayers, prayers not to God but to something else. One morning a monk discovered a moth pinned to Elias's desk. Its wings had been carefully cut into matching halves, its body placed between them in the shape of a cross. At first glance it looked like an act of childish cruelty. But when the monk leaned closer, he noticed a deliberate geometry in the arrangement. The lines of the wings aligned perfectly with the edges of the wooden desk, the body centered in unnatural precision. It was not random, it was crafted. Disturbed, the monk confiscated the remains, but Elias did not protest. He simply stared at the man with that unblinking patience that left even adults uneasy. Soon it escalated. Small birds brought down from the rafters appeared on his desk, their feathers stripped, their bones bent into shapes that mirrored the patterns he had once made with insects. Elias began carving numbers into the wood near his bed. Sequences that had no meaning to anyone else but seemed to follow an inner logic. The boys feared him openly now. They claimed he whispered to the creatures before he killed them, as if asking for permission, as if recording their final sound in his mind before silencing them forever. One boy swore he saw Elias hold a mouse in his hand and still its frantic heartbeat with nothing more than a stare until the tiny body fell limp. The brothers dismissed these tales as childish imagination, but they themselves began to avoid Elias when possible. Discipline, the very purpose of the monastery, seemed useless against him. When punished, he never cried, never begged, never even flinched. He accepted blows to his palms with the same silence he had shown since birth. his eyes steady on the faces of his punishers until they grew uncomfortable and looked away. More unsettling still was what followed. Weeks after one monk had struck him for disobedience, the man collapsed suddenly in the garden, his chest seizing, his breath stopping in violent gasps. The whispers began at once. Elias had marked him. The death was natural, perhaps, but the timing was too close to the boy's punishment, too close to his watchful silence. The monastery became a place of tension, as if everyone inside felt they were being observed, measured, recorded. The crucifixes on the walls no longer felt like protection, but like decoration before something far stronger. Elias carried himself through lessons with a calm that looked like reverence but felt like mockery. When asked to copy scripture, he did so with flawless precision, yet in the margins he sketched his spirals, his circles, his crude depictions of animals splayed open. He was teaching himself something beyond scripture, something that transformed suffering into a study. By the time his first year at the monastery ended, several of the boys had grown too frightened to sleep near him. They claimed that when the candles burned low, Elias moved among the beds, silent as shadow, his hands tracing invisible patterns in the air above their faces. Some said he whispered numbers as he did so, as though calculating how long they would last in the world. None dared report it directly for fear the attention itself might bring the very end they imagined. The brothers attempted to reframe his oddities as eccentric learning, but deep within the monastery's cold walls they knew they were watching something grow. Elias was not a child of curiosity. He was a child of method. Where others saw creatures to swat away, he saw material. Where others flinched at pain, he studied it. Where others prayed to God for mercy, Elias built a private school of pain, one small life at a time, and his lessons were only just beginning. The monastery took in orphans from nearby villages, children who had lost their families to famine and disease. They arrived thin and broken, meant to find shelter and education within the stone walls. Among them was a boy named Johann, quiet and timid, who had no parents to defend him. Elias watched him from the moment he entered, his eyes following the boy the way a hawk studies a mouse in the field. To the brothers, Elias and Johann were simply two lonely children. But in Elias's gaze, Johann was not a companion. He was material, another lesson waiting to be written in silence and flesh. The weeks passed in a rhythm of prayer, study, and labor. Yet Johann often disappeared from the group, wandering the darker corners of the monastery. At first, the brothers believed him lost or hiding from punishment. But whispers among the boys claimed that Johann was being called, drawn into Elias's shadow. They said Elias had spoken to him softly in the dormitory one night, not with comfort but with certainty, telling Johann that he would not live to see another harvest. Fear should have kept Johann away, yet he followed Elias as though under a spell, obeying with a trust that no one could explain. One cold morning, the brothers noticed Johann was missing again. His bed had not been slept in, and his chores lay unfinished. Hours of searching revealed nothing until a stench of rot seeped through the stones beneath the west wing. There, in a chamber rarely used and half forgotten, they found what none could forget. Johann's body was laid out on the floor, not in the manner of a murder, but in a deliberate arrangement. His limbs had been bent until joints split, forming a spiral that curled inward to his chest. His ribs had been pried open with crude tools, his organs placed around him like offerings at an altar. His heart rested in the center of the spiral, a grotesque crown to the pattern carved into flesh. The brothers recoiled in horror, crossing themselves, gagging at the smell, unable to comprehend the sight. It was not random violence, it was ritual, method, design. The shapes mirrored the insect arrangements Elias had once created on his desk. Spirals, symmetry, order. What had begun with fragile wings and brittle bones had now reached human form. The geometry of death had moved from insects to flesh. Each line carefully chosen, each wound purposeful. The brothers prayed desperately over the body, but their voices trembled as they did so. For they knew they were standing not in the presence of childish cruelty, but in the unfolding of something larger. Suspicion fell immediately on Elias. He had been seen with Johann often, watching him too closely, guiding him into corners of the monastery no child should wander. Yet when questioned, Elias offered nothing. He neither denied nor confessed. He only stared at the brothers, his silence heavier than any words. Some swore they saw a faint satisfaction in his gaze, as though their horror confirmed he had succeeded. Others claimed he was not proud, not angry, but merely curious, like a student awaiting the reaction to an experiment. The death of Johann shook the monastery to its core. Fear spread among the orphans who huddled together at night, refusing to sleep alone. They whispered that Elias could see the lines of their bones beneath their skin, already imagining how to bend them into shapes they could not endure. The brothers doubled their prayers, kept candles burning longer, and forbade Elias from being alone. Yet still the unease lingered, for they all knew the truth they dared not say aloud. No chains or rules could contain the hunger of a mind like his. Johann was buried quietly, his grave unmarked except for a small wooden cross. But the memory of his body's arrangement would not fade. The brothers tried to convince themselves that a beast had entered the monastery, that no child could conceive such precision, such order and brutality. Yet deep inside they knew Elias was not only capable, he was already moving beyond insects, beyond animals, into the shaping of human life and human death. The chamber where Johann had been found was sealed, but its presence lingered in every hallway. The boys refused to pass near it, and the brothers avoided speaking of it. But Elias had already chosen it as his sanctuary. It was no longer an orphan's resting place. It was his chamber, his first true creation, and in his mind, it was only the beginning. Word of Elias's unnerving presence spread beyond the monastery walls, carried by whispers from merchants and travelers. His silence, his stare, and the chamber where Johann had been found became the stuff of fearful rumor. Eventually it reached the ears of local physicians, men who believed in reason, in blood and bone, in ailments explained by humors and temperaments rather than demons. They came not to pray over Elias, but to study him, to see if science could reveal what faith could not. The first examination was simple. They measured his pulse, checked his breathing, tapped his knees with iron rods to watch his body react. Everything appeared ordinary until they looked closer. His pulse did not change under stress. His breathing stayed steady even when startled. Where other children's hearts raced with fear, Elias's remained calm, as if nothing within him could be unsettled. The physicians made notes with quills, muttering that the boy seemed to possess a nervous system beyond natural balance. but none of them could shake the unease they felt when his eyes locked onto theirs, as if he was not the subject of study but the one conducting it. They decided to test his mind. Elias was given images of suffering, drawings of bodies struck by plague, sketches of wounds, depictions of saints in torment. Most children would have cried, turned away, or shown pity. Elias only stared. Then, without being asked, he began to describe in detail how each figure must have died. He spoke of the sound lungs make when fluid fills them, of the sharp crack a neck gives when twisted too far, of the precise number of heartbeats between a wound and final silence. His words were not guesses. They were coldly exact, too clinical, too certain. The physicians grew pale, scribbling furiously, disturbed not only by his knowledge but by the tone in which he delivered it. Calm, emotionless, as if reporting weather. One of the physicians, a man named Dr. Schneider, insisted on examining Elias's brain. With primitive tools, they placed electrodes and crude instruments against his scalp, recording rhythms in ways barely understood at the time. What they found shook them more than any corpse. Elias's brain lit with irregular spikes, surges of activity unlike anything they had seen in living subjects. The patterns were chaotic yet purposeful, peaks of energy that rose and fell not with his movements, but with events around him. When a bird struck a window outside and fell dead, Elias's brainwave spiked moments before it happened, as though his body anticipated death the way others anticipate sound. The physicians argued in hushed tones. Some claimed epilepsy. Others spoke of madness, but none could explain the timing. How could a child's brain fire with such violence at the instant before another life ended? They tested it again and again, bringing in sick patients, animals on the verge of death, and each time Elias's brain surged just before the final moment. The boy himself remained silent, indifferent to their debates, his gaze shifting only when death arrived, his lips curving faintly as if he had expected the outcome all along. Rumors grew that Elias was not merely predicting death but feeding from it. The villagers outside the monastery said that when the physicians tested him, the boy's cheeks flushed. His body seemed more alive after each passing. They whispered that science had not uncovered a sickness but a hunger. The monks, disturbed by the reports, urged the doctors to leave, claiming that too much curiosity would only strengthen the evil within him. But curiosity had already taken root. Dr. Schneider and others began writing letters to universities, describing Elias as a phenomenon, perhaps the first human to perceive death not as mystery but as measurable certainty. Yet the physicians who lingered too long around him began to change. They spoke less of God and more of order, more of patterns, more of numbers. Elias's silence infected them, reshaping their thoughts. One left the monastery and never returned home, vanishing into the hills. Another was found dead at his desk, his notes stained with ink and blood, his heart collapsed without warning. Elias had watched both men with that same steady gaze, and the surviving doctors admitted what they dared not write. The boy's silence was not the absence of sound. It was the presence of something else, something that made even science tremble. By the end of their study, the physicians had proven nothing. Yet they carried scars that never left them. Some abandoned medicine, claiming the human body was too fragile to ever master. Others kept their writings hidden, convinced the world was not ready to read what they had seen in Elias's skull. The monks prayed harder. The villagers avoided his path. But Elias grew calmer, sharper, as though each test had only confirmed what he already knew. Death was not chance, not chaos. It was a system, and he alone could hear its rhythm. Beneath the monastery, where damp stone corridors twisted into darkness, Elias carved out a sanctuary that no priest could consecrate. The chamber where Johann had once lain became his workshop, and within its silence he began to construct something more enduring than spirals of bone or patterns of blood. To him, death was not only to be witnessed, it was to be recorded, and so the Museum of Skins began. It started with small pieces, scraps unnoticed in the chaos of sickness. When a boy coughed blood until he collapsed, Elias lingered near the infirmary. He took the cloth stained with skin where lips had cracked and peeled. Later, when the body was buried, he returned to the chamber and pressed the fragments flat against the wall, smoothing them like parchment. But fragments were not enough. Elias wanted whole stories. He wanted bodies transformed into records that could be read long after their voices had vanished. One evening, when fever claimed a young orphan too quickly for the monks to prepare his body, Elias moved silently through the corridors, lifting the corpse with the calm of a caretaker. He carried it not toward the burial ground, but down into his chamber. There, with tools stolen from the kitchens, knives dulled by use, hooks meant for meat, he began his work. It was not frenzied, it was deliberate. The skin peeled away slowly, stretched carefully until it lay flat against the cold stone like parchment awaiting ink. Organs were removed not as waste, but as material, placed in jars filled with brine and ash. The boy's face was preserved intact, his eyelids pinned open as if still watching. Elias whispered numbers as he worked, cataloging each piece. When he finished, the body was no longer a body. It was an entry in a library only he could read. The walls of his chamber grew covered with these pages. Skins dried into sheets, each one carved with symbols, spirals, and marks cut by Elias's own hand. He pressed numbers into flesh, recording sequences he believed linked the moment of death to the pattern of life. To the monks, death was the end. To Elias, it was data, something to be studied, shaped, and kept. He arranged the sheets with care as one arranges scripture. Each victim became part of his museum, each death a lesson written in human material. Soon the orphans began vanishing more often. At first the monks blamed hunger, thinking the children had fled into the forests in search of food. But rumors grew among the boys. Elias had called them, led them into the dark, and they never returned. The bravest whispered of screams echoing from beneath the floors, short-lived cries cut off by silence. The monks dismissed these tales as hysteria, but they grew uneasy. When Elias was seen near the sealed chamber late at night, his hands stained dark, though no candle was lit. One monk finally dared to follow him, creeping down the steps after curfew. What he found broke his mind. By the glow of a single candle, Elias stood before his wall of skins, whispering to them as though they were still alive. The monk fled, but he did not speak of it. Days later, he was found dead in his cell, his face pressed against the wall, mouth open in a silent scream. The others buried him quickly, yet suspicion returned to Elias. Still, they could not prove it. The boy remained calm, unbroken, his silence unshaken even as eyes turned against him. To Elias, these deaths were not crimes. They were contributions. Each body added to his collection, each sheet of skin pressed onto stone, a testament to the patterns only he could see. He believed he was building a scripture greater than any book the brothers read, a text of flesh and silence. And though the others feared him, Elias saw himself as a curator. The monastery was his cathedral, the dead his congregation, and in the shadows of his chamber he wrote their stories in the only language he trusted, the geometry of suffering preserved in skin. By the time his museum stretched across 3 walls, Elias had transformed death from tragedy into archive. Each page told him what no scripture could, that the human body was not sacred but useful, not final but eternal if preserved correctly. And as he whispered his numbers into the silence, his faith grew not in God but in the methodical permanence of his own work. Sister Magdalena had always been different from the others in the monastery. She was not naive to suffering, nor blinded by faith into ignoring it. Where the brothers spoke in hushed tones about Elias but did nothing, she watched him closely, unwilling to let silence grow into danger. She noticed how children disappeared more often when he lingered nearby, how he seemed too calm in the presence of the dying. She noticed the faint stains on his fingers that never washed away, and the hours he spent wandering near the sealed chamber in the west wing. Suspicion hardened into certainty. And so, one winter night, she followed him. The monastery lay in heavy silence, candlelight weak against the stone corridors. Magdalena trailed Elias from a distance, her sandals soft on the worn floors. He moved as though he belonged to the shadows, slipping through halls with the quiet of something more animal than human. She expected him to sneak into the kitchens or perhaps the infirmary where the sick lay unattended. But instead he stopped at the rusted iron door of the abandoned chamber, the place whispered of by boys who swore it was cursed. He lifted a stone from his pocket, revealed a hidden key beneath, and unlocked the door with a calm too practiced for a child. She slipped inside after him, keeping to the darkness. The air was thick, damp with the rot of things not meant to be stored. What she saw nearly drove her to cry out, but instinct forced her hands to her mouth. The walls, 3 of them, were covered in stretched sheets of human skin, dried and yellowed, marked with strange carvings and spirals. Organs floated in glass jars, arranged neatly on shelves as though catalogued. And there, at the far end of the chamber, Elias stood, whispering to the wall as if speaking with companions. His candlelight flickered against the veined parchment of human flesh, making it seem alive, as though watching her back. Magdalena's breath caught in her throat. She understood then that this was no child, no misunderstood boy cursed with visions. Elias was building something deliberate, something monstrous. And he had been doing it under their feet for months. Her first instinct was to flee, to tell the abbot to burn this chamber to the ground. But before she could turn, Elias spoke without looking at her. His voice was calm, low, certain. He told her she had seen too much, that she would stay here now, that the wall was waiting for her. She tried to run, but Elias was faster than his silence suggested. He caught her robe, dragged her forward with unnatural strength. She fought, nails scraping against stone, voice rising into a desperate cry that never reached the ears of the others. In the depths of that chamber, beneath layers of prayer and faith, her screams died into echoes that only the skins heard. When the monks awoke the next morning, Magdalena's bed was empty. They searched the grounds, prayed for her safety, but her body was nowhere to be found. Officially, they declared she had run away, perhaps overwhelmed by the horrors of famine and sickness. Secretly, the brothers knew they were lying to themselves. Weeks later, a draft swept through the west wing and loosened the wax seal around the chamber door. One curious monk dared to look inside. What he saw made him collapse in terror. On the far wall, stretched taut and smoothed like parchment, was the skin of Sister Magdalena. Her body had been stripped with surgical precision, her flesh displayed not as trophy but as veil. Her face was intact, her eyes sewn open, her lips fixed in a calm expression that seemed eerily alive. It was as though Elias had preserved her not only to remember her, but to make her a permanent witness to his work. The monks resealed the chamber, never speaking of what they had seen. Too terrified to confront the boy who had already proven that silence was his weapon, and death his canvas. From then on, whispers of Magdalena's fate spread in secret. Some said her spirit still lingered in the monastery, trapped in the stretched veil of her skin, watching over Elias's work with hollow eyes. Others claimed her face shifted in the candlelight, mouth opening in soundless screams that only the boy could hear. Elias himself would often sit before her preserved form for hours, staring back into the eyes he had stitched open. To him, she was not a victim. She was part of the archive, her body a page, her presence eternal. The monastery grew heavier with dread. Faith faltered and prayers rang hollow. Every corner seemed tainted by Elias's silence, every shadow stretched long by his watchful eyes. Sister Magdalena had been the only one brave enough to confront him, and now she had become part of his museum. The brothers understood the truth, but dared not admit it. Evil had taken root among them, not from the outside, not from the world they feared, but from within the very walls they thought were holy. And Elias, quiet as always, continued his work beneath them, more certain than ever that he was shaping something that would outlast them all. Elias had long seen death as a teacher, but by his adolescence he began to shape it as a language. The skins on his chamber walls were no longer random records, but entries in a system. He whispered numbers as he worked, counting beats, breaths, and fractures, marking each body as part of a larger equation. What had begun with insects and spirals had now matured into a precise obsession, the ritual of numbers. The monks first noticed it in the way deaths began to fall into strange rhythms. One week, a child in the infirmary coughed his last breath on the 7th day of illness, followed by another on the 14th. An elder brother collapsed in the chapel on the 21st. The pattern continued, sevens always sevens. When Elias was confronted, he said nothing. But later, beneath the floor, he carved the number 7 again and again into the parchment of flesh, as if confirming his authorship. Soon after, the rhythm shifted. Deaths began to follow spirals instead, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8. The Fibonacci sequence unfolding not in nature's petals, but in the timing of human lives stolen too soon. The bodies told the story more clearly than words. A boy was found with his fingers broken in sequence, each digit bent and arranged to mimic prime numbers, his corpse bent into a shape no accident could explain. A monk was discovered in the library, his blood drained in such a way that the stains on the floor formed a perfect spiral, as if ink spilled deliberately from a quill. Another was found in the garden, his ribs cracked outward, placed carefully like the petals of a flower. 13 bones in a design too precise to be chance. These were not killings of impulse or rage. They were calculated, staged, perfected. Elias began keeping a journal, though not in ink. He carved his sequences into bone. Tibias and femurs, stripped and cleaned, became his ledgers. He marked them with notches, each line representing a moment of death, each sequence a proof of his growing theory. He believed that suffering, when arranged correctly, revealed the structure of the universe, that God's silence was not absence but order waiting to be uncovered. And with each life taken, he pressed closer to that truth. Guided not by scripture but by the mathematics of cruelty. The monks, though terrified, began to notice their faith crumbling. They prayed to ward off his influence, but his rituals spread like an infection. Even those who despised him caught themselves counting breaths at night, tracing numbers in their prayers, unable to shake the feeling that Elias's order governed them as well. Some confessed in private that they feared God had abandoned the monastery and left only Elias's system behind. The abbot, broken by loss, ordered more fasting and penance. Yet his sermons were hollow, drowned out by the steady rhythm of deaths falling like clockwork around them. One brother, desperate to end the nightmare, attempted to kill Elias in his sleep. He crept into the dormitory with a blade, heart pounding, only to find Elias sitting upright, awake in the dark. Without fear, Elias whispered the time of his attacker's death down to the hour. The monk fled, but 3 days later he was found hanging from a tree, his body swaying in silence at precisely the moment Elias had foretold. After that, no one dared try again. The ritual of numbers had swallowed their will. Outside the monastery, rumors spread of unnatural order within its walls. Farmers spoke of bells ringing at exact intervals when a villager died, though no hand touched the ropes. Travelers whispered that the ground near the monastery grew cold in repeating patches, circles of frost even in summer, as if the earth itself was being drawn into Elias's calculations. Physicians returned, drawn by curiosity, but they left shaken, muttering that no science could explain a child who mapped mortality with such clarity. Beneath it all, Elias thrived in his chamber. The walls of skin had become his canvas, each page marked with numbers carved deep into flesh. Jars of organs were arranged in rows that matched prime sequences, their preservation timed to decay in predictable stages. He had turned death into both experiment and scripture, each victim a verse in his growing litany of silence. He no longer needed to speak much. The bodies spoke for him, their suffering arranged with mathematical certainty. By his 17th year, Elias had shaped a doctrine of horror that no church could deny. Death was no longer random within those walls. It followed the path he carved, step by step, number by number, spiral by spiral. To the brothers, it felt as though their monastery had been overtaken by a new religion, one not of salvation but of calculation. Elias had become its prophet, his altar a museum of flesh, his gospel a ritual written in numbers that promised not redemption but certainty. And certainty in the face of death was more terrifying than chaos. The monastery no longer felt like a place of God. It was a house of dread, its walls soaked with secrets the brothers refused to name aloud. candles burned through the night, not out of devotion, but out of fear that darkness might give Elias more room to work. Whispers traveled through every corridor that the boy had turned death itself into a ritual, that their prayers no longer held power, that the crucifixes on their walls had become little more than decoration. Faith, once their shield, had become fragile parchment in a storm of numbers and silence. Outside, rumors spread like wildfire. Villagers avoided the monastery's bells, claiming each toll marked another death inside. Merchants traveling the road swore they heard chanting beneath the stones, voices low and strange. Not the Latin of prayer, but something older, darker. Some said they saw Elias in the fields at night, standing motionless among the crops, his head tilted to the sky as though listening to rhythms no one else could hear. Fear of famine and plague no longer weighed as heavily on the village as the fear of the monastery itself. Parents warned their children not to look toward its towers after sunset, lest Elias's gaze find them. The abbot, broken by loss, tried to tighten discipline. He ordered endless fasts, long confessions, prayers until voices cracked. But the monks obeyed without conviction, their eyes empty, their faith hollow. They knew what he refused to say aloud, that Elias had bent their world into his own order, that God had been silenced in these halls. Some brothers claimed they felt themselves being measured, their footsteps counted, their breaths timed, as if the boy's system had swallowed not just their deaths but their living hours too. The abbot himself began to crumble. His sermons grew frantic, his words cracked with desperation, and finally he admitted in whispers to the others that perhaps the devil had truly claimed them all. When news of the monastery's decay reached the bishopric, investigators were dispatched. They arrived with stern faces, clothed in authority and righteousness, determined to expose superstition and restore order. They entered the monastery convinced that fear had simply grown too strong among weak men. Yet the longer they stayed, the more they faltered. Elias watched them with the same steady silence he had shown since birth. He answered no questions, but when pressed, he began to describe them, not their lives, but their ends. He spoke of one investigator falling from a horse and breaking his neck, of another coughing blood until his body collapsed, of a third swallowed by fire when his house burned in the night. Each death was given with exact details, times, and conditions. The investigators tried to dismiss it as manipulation, but unease gnawed at them. Days later, word came from the villages. One had indeed fallen from his horse, just as Elias had said. Another began coughing blood in his sleep, unable to recover. The third, still alive, abandoned the monastery in terror, riding through the night only to perish months later in a fire that consumed his home. Those who remained at the monastery grew pale and quiet, unable to deny what they had witnessed. Elias did not threaten them. He simply predicted. And when the predictions became reality, their authority withered. The collapse of faith was not sudden. It was a slow erosion. Each unanswered prayer, each fulfilled prophecy, each whispered number from Elias's lips cracked the foundation of belief. Monks stopped confessing. They stopped singing hymns. They clung to their rituals like drowning men clutching driftwood, knowing the sea was stronger. Some abandoned their vows and fled, but most stayed, hollow-eyed and broken, because even escape seemed measured in Elias's gaze. They feared he had already counted their final breaths, that leaving would change nothing. In the end, the monastery became not a house of worship, but a vessel for Elias's silence. Crosses still hung on the walls, but their wood felt dead. The chapel still echoed with voices, but only in mutters and half-prayers. Faith no longer lived here. It had been replaced by order, an order born of numbers, spirals, and the certainty that death answered to Elias more than to God. And outside, the village looked upon the monastery with dread, for they knew its collapse was not only the ruin of faith inside stone walls, but a shadow creeping outward ready to spread. The monastery no longer felt like a place of God. It was a house of dread, its walls soaked with secrets the brothers refused to name aloud. Candles burned through the night not out of devotion, but out of fear that darkness might give Elias more room to work. Whispers traveled through every corridor that the boy had turned death itself into a ritual, that their prayers no longer held power, that the crucifixes on their walls had become little more than decoration. Faith, once their shield, had become fragile parchment in a storm of numbers and silence. Outside, rumors spread like wildfire. Villagers avoided the monastery's bells, claiming each toll marked another death inside. Merchants traveling the road swore they heard chanting beneath the stones, voices low and strange, not the Latin of prayer, but something older, darker. Some said they saw Elias in the fields at night, standing motionless among the crops, his head tilted to the sky as though listening to rhythms no one else could hear. Fear of famine and plague no longer weighed as heavily on the village as the fear of the monastery itself. Parents warned their children not to look toward its towers after sunset, lest Elias's gaze find them. The abbot, broken by loss, tried to tighten discipline. He ordered endless fasts, long confessions, prayers until voices cracked. But the monks obeyed without conviction, their eyes empty, their faith hollow. They knew what he refused to say aloud, that Elias had bent their world into his own order, that God had been silenced in these halls. Some brothers claimed they felt themselves being measured, their footsteps counted, their breaths timed, as if the boy's system had swallowed not just their deaths, but their living hours too. The abbot himself began to crumble. His sermons grew frantic, his words cracked with desperation, and finally he admitted in whispers to the others that perhaps the devil had truly claimed them all. When news of the monastery's decay reached the bishopric, investigators were dispatched. They arrived with stern faces, clothed in authority and righteousness, determined to expose superstition and restore order. They entered the monastery convinced that fear had simply grown too strong among weak men. Yet the longer they stayed, the more they faltered. Elias watched them with the same steady silence he had shown since birth. He answered no questions, but when pressed, he began to describe them. Not their lives, but their ends. He spoke of one investigator falling from a horse and breaking his neck, of another coughing blood until his body collapsed, of a third swallowed by fire when his house burned in the night. Each death was given with exact details, times, and conditions. The investigators tried to dismiss it as manipulation, but unease gnawed at them. Days later, word came from the villages. One had indeed fallen from his horse, just as Elias had said. Another began coughing blood in his sleep, unable to recover. The third, still alive, abandoned the monastery in terror, riding through the night, only to perish months later in a fire that consumed his home. Those who remained at the monastery grew pale and quiet. unable to deny what they had witnessed. Elias did not threaten them. He simply predicted. And when the predictions became reality, their authority withered. The collapse of faith was not sudden. It was a slow erosion. Each unanswered prayer, each fulfilled prophecy, each whispered number from Elias's lips cracked the foundation of belief. Monks stopped confessing. They stopped singing hymns. They clung to their rituals like drowning men clutching driftwood, knowing the sea was stronger. Some abandoned their vows and fled, but most stayed, hollow-eyed and broken because even escape seemed measured in Elias's gaze. They feared he had already counted their final breaths, that leaving would change nothing. In the end, the monastery became not a house of worship but a vessel for Elias's silence. Crosses still hung on the walls, but their wood felt dead. The chapel still echoed with voices, but only in mutters and half-prayers. Faith no longer lived here. It had been replaced by order, an order born of numbers, spirals, and the certainty that death answered to Elias more than to God. And outside, the village looked upon the monastery with dread, for they knew its collapse was not only the ruin of faith inside stone walls, but a shadow creeping outward, ready to spread. Centuries passed, and the boy who once silenced a monastery and dissolved a court into chaos became a figure half remembered in whispers, half erased in deliberate records. Elias's name vanished from official documents, scrubbed by clerics who hoped that silence might undo what silence had once created. Yet his shadow endured, not in stories of miracles or sainthood, but in fragments too stubborn to decay. In an abandoned wing of the monastery, stones were pulled down for repair, and behind them were found remnants of parchment that were not parchment at all. Sheets of skin, thinned and dried, marked with strange numbers and spiral carvings, had been hidden between the walls. They bore no scripture, no holy text, only the geometry of cruelty. The discovery horrified the brothers who remained, but scholars who later examined the fragments did not dismiss them as superstition. They found order in the patterns, sequences of numbers that matched natural growth, mathematical constants, alignments of moon and tide. To the scientists of a later century, it was not the work of a mad child, but of a mind cataloging death with the precision of an early physicist. The fragments were locked away in archives, studied by few, whispered about by many. Rumors claimed that those who handled the skins too long grew unwell, that their dreams filled with spirals, that their sleep was measured into patterns they could not escape. As time passed, the monastery itself was abandoned, left to ruin on a hill overgrown with ivy. Villagers avoided it, calling it cursed. Yet historians and physicians returned again and again, unable to resist the lure of Elias's legacy. Some insisted his brain had been unique, that his silence masked a neurological phenomenon beyond comprehension. Others believed he was proof that cruelty and order could merge, that the human mind was capable of reshaping death into structure. But among the villagers, the stories remained simpler. Elias was a child who belonged more to the grave than to life, and his shadow had outlived them all. Eventually, the government was forced to act. Families of those who had vanished in the monastery pressed for recognition. Survivors' tales passed down through generations grew too loud to ignore. A memorial was raised on the grounds, a stone wall carved with the names of lost orphans, mothers, and brothers, though many names had long since been forgotten. Laws were drafted soon after, forbidding the unmonitored confinement of children in monasteries or orphanages, forcing institutions to keep records that could not be so easily erased. Society told itself it had learned from Elias that no child would be left so unseen, no silence left so unchecked. But the memorial itself stood empty more often than not, visited only by the curious or the superstitious, a reminder that memory fades faster than fear. In academic halls, the debate over Elias never ceased. Was he a seer cursed to witness the end of others, or a psychopath who found beauty in destruction? Was he born silent because silence was his weapon, or did silence grow around him because no one dared speak the truth? Every theory failed to erase the unease his story carried. His predictions, his museum of skins, his courtroom collapse, they were not just history but warnings. They revealed how easily faith cracked under pressure, how quickly science bent when faced with mystery, how silence itself could dominate more completely than screams. And so his legacy lived not only in parchment and stone, but in the questions he left behind. Evil, Elias proved, does not always arrive with fire and fury. Sometimes it arrives quietly, in the body of a child who never cries, never flinches, never blinks. Sometimes it grows in corners where people avert their eyes, where silence is easier than truth. And sometimes it survives for centuries, hidden in walls, etched in numbers, waiting to be found again. The story of Elias is not just about a boy who saw death before it happened. It is about the cost of ignoring the signs of evil when it hides behind innocence. His silence devoured a monastery, unraveled a court, and still unsettles those who study him. The memorial on the hill bears a single question carved into its base. What is remembered and what is erased? It is a question not only for the past but for the present, because silence has not vanished from the world. Children still disappear behind walls of institutions, voices still go unheard, cruelties still grow in corners no one dares to look. Elias's story lingers as a reminder that evil thrives not in the loudness of violence, but in the quiet comfort of looking away. And as the narration closes, the question lingers heavy, meant not for historians but for those listening now. What do you think? Could this happen again?